X and get us started here. So welcome to Friday Morning Serial. It's good to have Geneva and Chloe. Well, it's good to have Chloe here. And today we are just very fortunate to hear from Ronnie Harris. So Ronnie is his organization called Sacred Roots, and I don't know if he's going to tell us much about his own history, but it's his wonderful story of growing up here, being away, and now coming back to really make some real significant changes in, here in Gulfport. And as you can see, he has a lot to talk about. He's already set up. So we will, without any further ado, turn the time over to Ronnie.
Thank you. I'm a little bit nervous because Chloe is here today. There's been okay, so relax. There's been a number of times I've been chatting on a business call with her, Chloe's mom, and Chloe's been in the car, and so to see her in person, I kind of feel like that student that has come to the final and got to give this presentation, and the prof showed up today. But thanks for being here, Chloe. I start that way because I think why we're here and what I'm doing is for Chloe. At the end of my email that I send out is, it talks about, I think it's an African proverb that says, we will plant trees, whose shade we will never sit under. So I think much of what this is, much of what I want to talk about and share about today is really not for us per se, or even me. I think it's for Chloe and the generation to come, is what I'm hoping. I have entitled this talk, They Got Rid of Porches. I don't know at what point in the presentation I'll get to talking about porches, but I know that I entitled it that because I wanted to talk today about what motivates me about this project. So I sort of give it from different angles in different places. Yesterday at the Rotary, I was talking about it in the context of reimagining development, and I talked about it in economic terms and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to sort of chat about that too here today. But really, I just want to share this group, my heart, what brought me home. In part because I think it's what established this place, this Gulf Coast community design studio. A fella off the East Coast came down here to lend some services, some help after Katrina, and fell in love with the place, and ultimately didn't leave, couldn't leave, and so we're grateful, right? It's hard. So today I want to talk hard. I switched to Mac recently for you techies and millennials that might be watching this later, and struggling to sort of make that happen. One of the things I learned both yesterday and it was reinforced today is that you're supposed to actually, with a Mac, have all your stuff. Like you're supposed to compact with it all because connecting it to projectors and stuff doesn't kind of compute. But we're going to make this work. I have 82 slides on this deck. But
we have a whole lot of cereal.
But in the keynote that's on Apple, that was all supposed to just be rolling even while we were having coffee, and it was going to repeat. And all of these pictures are pictures you guys know. They are pictures repeating of development here on the Gulf Coast. That one is perhaps of interest for some of you because it is an amazing, I think, historic preservation project in Turkey Creek.
It's called the Phoenix Analyst or Yaryan. It has kind of a couple names.
That's right.
Just around the corner from there.
Yeah. So the pictures we've found through really just demonstrate that we know how to do development on the Gulf Coast. We have long known how to do development on the Gulf Coast. Part of how I express how significant that is around the world is I say we actually, due to a hurricane, quite oftentimes get to start over. Not that we want to, but we have to. And so we not only can develop, but we have to be resilient in doing so. And so part of my presentation really is to talk about a project that's dear to my heart that ultimately is in my hyper local neighborhood. Historic Cedar City is about, I think, 0.5 miles away from here. Okay, great. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. 0.5 miles away from here. Centrally located, I think, between what is the Central Business District, and for some of you, I know I'm preaching to the choir, Central Business District and new development on the beach. It is just south of the airport, and so its proximity to the Central Business District here in Gulfport, in many contexts, makes it a vulnerable community that is susceptible to all kinds of things like gentrification, and we haven't seen that yet, but what we have seen is economic isolation. And for about 50 to 60 years, which is my lifetime, Chloe, if you can believe that, this community has been on a dime. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that a number of folk that have an interest to see this community emerge as a community of promise and improved livability can see that change to include Chloe's mom, Geneva, that's working on bike ped infrastructure improvement, and so we're excited about that because part of what I think would make it a more livable community is if people could walk, bike, and or use public transportation. It is said, and you guys know, I'm preaching to the choir with you, a community that walk, bike, and use public transit is healthier, safer, and more economically feasible, and economically prosperous. And so a lot of times folks say, well, Ronnie, you're into the bikes and you seem to be doing all these other things. What's up with that? And I said, well, you know, we struggle from hypertension, diabetes, you name it. To improve upon bike ped infrastructure is to address some of those health disparities. Went down the wrong way. This is a little bit about me. My family has been here. Many of the homes in Cedar City was built by my forefathers' hands. And so I have a very deep-seated vested interest to see this community emerge to be a far more livable community. Not just for us and for my memory's sake, but neighboring Broadmoor, neighboring Broad Acres, across the tracks, 2nd Street, also all have a vested interest, I think, to see this community emerge to be a more livable community. That is my family when we were in the Kill of Mississippi, Kill, Mississippi, for those that will watch this later. I love to tell the story that my great grandfather received a land grant from the U.S. government and needed the signature of 7 white men to access it. And Brett Favre's great grandfather was one of those white men that signed it. We spoke about that just recently. That's me. The bow tie is not a new thing. Just got small. Butterfly. Anybody know Senator Paul Simon? Senator Paul Simon was a senator of the state of Illinois back in the day. And so that's who really hooked me on the bow tie that long ago. It gets smaller. That pin on my lapel is the U.S. and Scotland. Got a master's degree in community learning and development from the University of Aberdeen. And that was a wonderful experience because one of the things it did was allow me to examine myself and my life the entire master's program was designed around work I had already previously did the last 20 years. So if you could imagine having professors and colleagues sort of like critique everything you've ever done. And so I began to think about like self-determination in communities. Like, was I going into communities, black, white, or other, and valuing the people, what they might have to say about what their neighborhood should be. And so I learned a lot. Hopefully I'm applying that in my practice today. During COVID, I worked for an international development firm based out of Chicago called Sacred Roots. We've done international development around the world, but during COVID, everybody was working from home. And so I relocated back home here to Gulfport and went and bought the corner store I grew up going to, historic Broadmoor. Some people might know Broadmoor. It's on Kelly Avenue for those that are watching later. This store, I think, is amazing in that even during the height of segregation, this was a store where both historically black Surrey City and historically white Broadmoor and or 2nd Street would find ourselves at this store. Since Katrina, prior to me acquiring the building, this store was in disrepair. But I bought it. It's on Kelly, which is, I think, picture perfect of gerrymandering, and that one side of the street is District 119, or was before our redistricting, so I need to change that in the speech. It was historic District 119, and across the street is 120. One side street is the 2nd Ward, and across the street is the 3rd Ward, one senator. And so right on Kelly, you can see the divide. And while for some folk that is a dark reality, for me, it's an opportunity. And so it's why I in fact wanted the store, because I'm convinced that segregation in all of its forms is part of what allows economic isolation and things of that sort to fester. So I wanted to acquire the store to see it be developed so that ultimately we can bridge this divide and have a more robust sense of community. Again, I said we can do development on the coast. These pictures, you know, the thing that all these pictures have in common are they're here on the Gulf Coast, and they, to a great extent, had one person decide they wanted to see change in a neighborhood. So this here is a quick video. It's 2 minutes. I won't play it for the sake of time because I want to get to Q&A, but I'll email it to anybody that wanted. It's a beautiful video that does the very same thing that the pictures just did. It just sweeps across the Gulf Coast to show all of the opportunities, all of the examples of where we have done some amazing development. Some adaptive reuse, where there's an old building is just in disrepair, and as opposed to just tearing it down, which is sort of commonplace around the world, they built something nice out of it. Walter Anderson Museum in Ocean Springs. What you also notice in that presentation is we went from Bay St. Louis to Gulfport. Now we've jumped over to Ocean Springs, and we're going to keep coming this way. This is one of my favorite because I think it is very similar to what we're trying to do on Kelly with the Broadmoor. It's the Roos. If you haven't been there, do get there. I think it's really nice. They took one little part that was a hotel in disrepair and just continued to just build out. It's special. Parks in Biloxi. The Bella, the old bank building, is being turned into a boutique hotel. Again, an adaptive reuse that I think is like really, really cool. Perhaps you know the amazing center in Gulfport, and this is on the docket to be built. on, anybody know where that is? Downtown, where 90 and 49 meet on the west corner. That's a development that is sort of on the docket to merge and come. But here's Kelly. I am dubbing this the Gulfport Gaslight District, and I'm considering it a T. This is earmarked a neighborhood business corridor. I say that to some folk in the neighborhood and they laugh, like neighborhood business, okay, corridor, okay. But again, there are businesses along here, and there was a time in history, I do remember this, where money in Surrey City changed hands 7 times. There was a time in Surrey City where I had one rule in it: get home before dark. There was a time in Surrey City where, like, my grandfather worked at offshore. By the time he got home, his money was spent because my grandmother would go and get his check and come back to the neighborhood, and she would go grocery shopping, she'd go pick up the cleaners, she would go and do all the things. And by the time he got home, he got a little envelope, and it was his allowance to the next paycheck. There was a time in Surrey City where there were no brownfields. There was, well, right here where what was a brownfield, because that's not necessarily a brownfield anymore, it's a splash pad today. But right here at that intersection, in a green field, it said the elders of the community came together to have a civil rights meeting about the ever infamous beach sit-in. And so that meeting took place in historic Surrey City. And my uncle Newt at the time was one of the zoning officers for the city of Gulfport. So that's how we kind of put together that it was probably somewhere in and around Surrey City. The legend is they just met in a field. That's the field. But Surrey City is where we're trying to develop what, again, we're dubbing the Gulfport Gaslight District. It is a neighborhood business off Main Street commercial corridor development. A whole lot of words to say. We would like to see not just my brick and mortar, this corner store I bought, be developed, but I am interested in seeing this entire neighborhood corridor come up. Because in so doing, I don't just develop my property for me and my family, but this development provides economic stimulus to this neighborhood that used to be thriving neighborhood. We're in our second phase. The second phase is to build out, again, the historic Broadmoor store. We have right now initial renderings. We have right now a number of community engagement efforts we've gone through. You'll see right here on the floor, for those that are in the room, this one says the Surrey City neighborhood. And that's just sort of an infographic memo of some of the details that were discussed in roundtable discussions with our community. The Surrey City community. So I went to historic Black Surrey City and we had conversations. And then I went to historic Broadmoor, which is a historically white neighborhood, and we had conversations. And you'll see the similarities between what these diverging along race lines communities had to say about what they would like to see in their neighborhoods. It's almost identical. So while society might want to divide us along race lines, while the stations of life for many people in these neighborhoods is such that, like, they're economically isolated, a number of folks in Broadmoor that were upper middle class either didn't manage money well or had a mate get sick or for whatever reason just didn't get out, couldn't get out. didn't move to Second Street, didn't move to Charlotte. They're still in that neighborhood. They're 90 years old, and here's what's sad. I watched some of these neighbors behind gates, afraid to go out of their house. And I want that to change, and that's some of what this is all about. So I want to pause there. Oh, no, before I do, I want to say what I think is really, really important. One, we have a application sitting before the state legislature right now to receive Gulf Coast restoration funds for this project. We are asking them for the tune of $898,000 to not, again, just restore this historic building, because I don't think that would be neighborhood development much. But we want to sidewalks, streetscape, you name it. We'd like to see this entire corridor come up. This concept anchored at these three diverging. I would argue Second Street could be considered part of this. So 4 diverging communities along race lines and economic lines and all of that is right here on Kelly. And so our goal is to improve healthcare access and quality, education, neighborhood and the built environment, economic stability, social and community context, to bring people back together. We're inspired by all kinds of things. But the thing that I am most inspired to do in this, and it is included in this Gulf Coast Restoration Funds application, is to come up with what I'm calling a trauma-informed reinvestment plan. Most developers don't have to consider that. I hate to just throw him under the bus, but I don't think Elliott Homes have to consider that. I think he can go into a given community, they can purchase lots or whatever, and they could just build. I have as a deep-seated sense of responsibility to be very careful about how we build. You can give me $2 million right now, and I can go and hire GCs, and I can just do all kinds of things on this corridor tomorrow, which are $2 million. But it very well might displace somebody in one of these communities. And so again, our trauma-informed community reinvestment plan takes that into consideration, and we're like pulling people together that can really help us think about like, how do we do development and do development well? Because again, they showed you all these pictures of how we do development. We know how to do development. America knows how to do development. The world over, people know how to do development. I remember the first time I visited Ethiopia, you fly into the capital city, and the airport just is on Bowley Road. And Bowley Road, Main Street, was full of shanties, like little small tin huts. And this was 2004. Go there now, and it's the Hilton. It's the high-end boutique hotels and shops and stuff. And so even in Ethiopia, they know how to do development. But I'm trying to do development in a way that is responsible for the people that live there, so that they can also access some of these amenities that would naturally come to this area and ultimately be able to thrive, live in place, and not be displaced. Back to we got rid of porches. All over the world, I'm asked a single question. What happened? Some folks are kind of nervous and they go, well, you know, America, can you tell us like what's happening in those neighborhoods? And you guys could read between those lines, you know, Black gentlemen, what happened? America, guns, violence, those neighborhoods, what? So it's coded to ask me, really, to be quite crass, what's up with you Black people? What's up with the hood? What's going on? Why so much crime and violence? And because the images they are getting from the BBC and everybody else is, that's what it is. So anywhere I go, I'm asked this question, like, your community gave us jazz and gave us blues and gave us so many inspiring things still in your movies today. Like, you just move us like nobody can. And then you got Oprah, and you got Michael Jordan, and you got, so like, what's going on in the neighborhood? Like, what happened? And I argue, got rid of porches. And they said, got rid of porches. For some folk, you got to articulate what a porch is. But I say, built environment, house, front, porch. Oh, yeah. And in any given context, they'll articulate for me what they call a porch. So, yeah, that. But then I'll talk about like how norms are translated and taught on those porches. I remember I used to like duck through alleyways and even go under houses or all kinds of things to not walk the street because any given elder in my community could call me on a porch to give me our lecture on whatever he or she felt like that day. Now I look back on it though, they were teaching me some valuable stuff. They were instilling in me a sense of history and responsibility and all of these powerful things. I remember I was 19 before I realized that Aunt Ruthie, the second Aunt Ruthie, because I knew I had one Aunt Ruthie, but the second Aunt Ruthie wasn't really my aunt at all. But then I learned that my uncle knew, built homes, and the oldest, I think he's still the oldest Gulfport resident is Taylor Howard at 104, my cousin, who again built all kinds of stuff in historic Sioux City. Lily Young, my cousin, had the corner store, built all kinds of stuff. And so many times sitting on porches, come here, boy, come here. Dare say, no, I'm busy. I'm on my phone. I got headphones in. No. And so I was on that porch and he would remind me of who I am and who my neighbors are and how I have a responsibility to their welfare. And so again, all of this is to say, if we want to really get to what's the problem, I don't know. We debate all the time about guns and we debate all the times about all kinds of things, and we need those debates for sure. But I think some more basic things is what we really need to begin to start thinking about. And in this room, I feel comfortable saying that. But for those that might listen later, and I'm telling the world over, whoever will listen to me, like we have to like start with the built environment. Like how we build streets or not build streets, how we build sidewalks or not build sidewalks. Do we want it really, really big where like my neighbor is way over there? We all have to interact with each other, right? Or do we build faster roads going through our neighborhood where like I don't even have to stop at the porch because I hop in my car and I'm going through. Porches, how we build buildings and restore buildings, all of that I think has to become ever increasingly part of the discussion if we want to see our neighborhoods be revitalized. Because when people ask me, Ronnie, what is it that undergirds for you such a deep sense of responsibility to your neighbor? I can't point to anything. I can't point to anything but that upbringing, that those lessons taught on those porches, the sense of connectability in these neighborhoods. And those are the things I want to see be restored. So if somebody asks me, if you do, well, why would you go back and buy this store that was in disrepair? And if you're so enamored with historic Black Sioux City, why didn't you buy something deep in Sioux City? Why did you buy it on the border there? All of those questions really get back to, I really have a heart to see us be reconnected to some deeper, more profound stuff that will be sustainable over time. So that in building this stuff, in rebuilding neighborhoods, it won't necessarily be for us, but when Chloe looks back on what we contributed while we were here, what we did with our time while we were here, she might feel like, hey, yeah, they did what they were supposed to do with regard to what they left us. So responsibilities for this Gulf Coast Restoration Funds that could really help get this done. These are some of the guys that we're banking on. Right now, it's sitting on the Mississippi Southern Delegation desk, this application is. And so my ask for you in the room and anybody that might watch this later is that if you have any means of reaching out to these guys and gals, either by phone and or by text and or by email, do them all, to say to them if you're in support of this project. I would like to see this project be among some of those you consider when you consider allocating funds, Gulf Coast Restoration Funds, to this project.
How do we refer to it? What will they know it as?
They would know it as the Gulfport Gaslight District.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you take your phone and scan there, that barcode will take you to a form you can fill out, and we'll send a letter for you. Otherwise, you can go to our website, www.sacredroots.com/support, and it'll show you these very same pictures. And on these pictures, if you tap on it, it'll go to his phone. You can call it. So go to our website and you can get his phone. So again, what you see, what we've done is went across the Gulf Coast showing you the Southern Delegation. This good brother here is in real estate development himself. Perhaps some of you guys know that. Called it. Needs a spell. Him to really look into this project to see if it'll be something he can support. This is our senator, Kelly Ave, these diverging communities is in his state district. So if you know Brother Mike Thompson, give him a call. And if you can, he's in Jackson right now, I suspect, but most of them will be on Highway 49 coming home about 3:30, 4 o'clock. And we have a community forum here, right here, same place at 6 o'clock. And so if you know his phone number and call him, we'd love to see him show up. There's a number of people in the community don't understand the redistricting process and so aren't even familiar with or are in belief that Hullum, for an example, is their rep when now maps have been changed. And this historic Black community, I learned this in the middle of the night and it freaked me out. The redistricting maps are such that a historic Black community, Surrey City, that has always been a historic Black district, District 119, is now with Representative Bennett. 85% of the community is with Bennett. So people in Long Beach are in our district after the redistricting.
What is the date of that redistricting? What was the date? Just last year?
Yeah, just last year. I'm grateful. Questions? Zoe. Oh, sorry.
But I know you talked about this a while back, but I did not want to interrupt your presentation. What is a corpse gate? Like you said you're like when you talked to a guy, he was like a corpse gate. A porch. Oh, a porch gate?
Yes.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah, what is a
Yeah.
porch gate?
Yeah.
Gate that's a porch.
Yeah, so the front gate, you know, you go into a neighborhood and they've got the little gate that go cling cling, the little thing that, yeah.
People used to have gates there.
Yeah.
People into your yard.
Yeah. So I think you raise a good question because there are some communities that don't have gates, fence. They have beautiful porches, grass lawns, friendly, welcoming landscape, and then there are communities that's got like these gates and stuff. And so I long for the day that there are no gates in the porch. I mean, gates saying stay out, but rather fighting neighborly.
Well, I was going to say, Chloe, if I'm sure you've been on some of the East Biloxi bike rides and you ride all in there. And a lot of those neighborhoods, their houses sit back a little bit, but there's a fence out front and there's gates. That,
Yeah, so none of the bikers go in their houses.
right, so the pedestrians know this is where we can
Yeah.
stay and this is where the family lives. But I was going to talk about the East Biloxi bike rides myself, and that one of the things I love about, and I have 2 years, but one of the things I used to love about going on those bike rides is we would ride all through East Biloxi before we hop on the bridge. And as we'd ride in the evenings, especially, people would be out there on their porches sitting, and we'd wave and they'd say hello and their dogs would go crazy, and it's just such a connection between the family and the street activity.
Yeah.
And that of course doesn't happen when you're in a vehicle, but
Right.
it happens when you're walking and feel safe to walk or ride your bike through an area. So that those porches exist in East Biloxi and perhaps even in Sawyer City, but the communities are in dire disrepair and suffering from disinvestment, obviously, due to the redistricting. But as you plan this, and as you move forward, and as you're having conversations with these thinkers that you've mentioned, how do you really prevent gentrification once that community becomes something that's appealing and to the masses? What can happen to prevent the longtime residents from being priced out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm wrestling. My first answer is, I don't know. One of my favorite profs in college was a guy that could say, I don't know. So I'm modeling him, showing him. I don't know. That's my first question. But I got an inclination that it starts with respecting the human being, the human spirit. And so I say that to say that I get into a lot of fights with colleagues and friends and family, especially. That I'm not opposed to gentry, because in the root of the term, it's development, and I'm for development. I'm pro-development. So I'm not against gentry. I just would like to see us have responsible gentry. I think there is a way of doing development responsibly. And so at the root of your question of how do we do it, I think one of the things, I wrote my master's thesis on the commuter church. Because one of the things I identified with Sawyer City and a number of historic Black communities is the overwhelming majority of those that go to church on Sunday or Wednesday or Friday's service for some of those churches is they don't live in the neighborhood. And they used to. They used to.
They leave and they never come back.
Yeah.
And that's why you're-
And I think that leaves a community vulnerable. Right now in Sawyer City, few homeowners are invested in what's going on in the neighborhood. I've invited like 14 of them here tonight. It'll be the first time they're all in the same room, because I want us to all see some of this, to see that we all have some very same interests. They talk about gentrification all the time. Oh yeah, white people are coming and they're going to take over the neighborhood. I'm like, really? Or are you going to give it to them? Like, really? Like, how many times have we had conversations to begin to understand how vulnerable the neighborhood is to displacement as a result of it being renters? That's what it is. Like, you're going to be hard pressed to get my auntie to sell her house. For real. Everybody, some cities you can go in, or towns you can go in, there's like big developments, high rises, and then you see this little building or little house that just would not sell. That'll be my auntie. But part of why it would be her is because she has a sense of who built that house. As a little girl, she passed my granddad nails to help build that house. So you can come with the big check, but something's going to move her differently than others who are renting. I think that's why we have so much like decay in the neighborhood, because people don't own. And so we got to get up underneath some of the debates we have and begin to really just open up tables. I call this series on the tables. After the race, table talks, because we see our elected officials during election time, but not necessarily afterwards until the next race. And so this table talk series is after the race. Let's come to the table and talk about some of these things.
Have you looked at all into either partnering with or starting some sort of community land trust to
Yes.
help manage that?
Yes, yeah. So for the record and for anybody that is in the room, Gulf Coast Design Studio did work in Sur City back in
A while ago.
a while ago.
Yeah, like
It was right before I
2012.
started,
Something like that.
yeah.
Yeah, and out of those conversations and that work, there continued to be conversation about land trust. Dorothy
Yep.
Clendon
London.
kind of led that. She's
Yep.
dead and gone, God
Yeah.
bless her soul. But there are others that want to have that conversation. But then, as you can expect, there are others that think that's just another form of takeover. But we need to have that healthy conversation about like land trust, what that might look like. So,
I mean, it is a mechanism for the community retaining some control and also for preserving some of that affordability in the midst of.
First off, it's so good to just to, to kind of learn from you. I have a couple questions. One is a kind of specific question, and that is on Kelly, there are a couple of real obvious property owners. I'm just curious kind of where you are with them. One is the church across the street, and the other is the gas station that are there, and I'm just interested in kind of how they fit in to, to kind of what you're doing.
I'll come back to the church. Chevron, I haven't engaged Chevron much because I presumed it to be, a big box corporation, and they're just going to do what they do. And so ultimately, I do want to reel them in when we start talking about beautification of the neighborhood, because I would like to see them buy into some streetscape design stuff. But I haven't really tried to like reach out and cultivate a relationship with them yet. But around the corner is Annette's Tavern, and it kind of looks displaced itself. Actually, it looks like, yeah, it looks from the street like it should be in rural Mississippi for some folk. I love the place though. I love Annette. Annette moved here from Idaho, I think. Was a waitress, and then the owner wanted to sell the building, so now she bought it. So now she's and it stayed packed, by the way. It's not neighborhood people for the most part, but it stayed packed. So I've cultivated this relationship with her. We have worked together to put on a Christmas gathering, we call it, at dusk. Because another thing, what I'm doing, even before any of this can take off, is employing placemaking, just a bike ride, community bike rides, and just low level, low fruit stuff to build relationships, right? So we have that within that. Haven't really sought it with Chevron. If we come to the opposite side of the T, there's a mechanic shop there too on Kelly and Railroad. He's 80, wants to sell, wants to move to Florida, so he's looking for a buyer. He ultimately wants somebody that's going to be a mechanic. Next to it is the Mensa's property. They had it on the market for too much money, and so folk weren't wanting to buy it. And then we have what most folk line up 90 people in the neighborhood, and 87 of them are going to say our trouble child, which is this little corner store. But this little corner store makes money. I mean, it's packed all the time. But it's one of those little liquor stores, got all the signs outside, say split smoke liquor and beer, cigarettes and stuff and stuff and stuff. And so from my perspective, that's violence. I think it's violence to kids, little guys that's riding their bikes. The booming car pulls up, boom, 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 boom. But we could put on an at dusk gathering, or we could have a bike ride where people are on my property right across the street from this corner store. Crickets. It's like they make phone calls and go, hey, don't come up to the store right now. You never know who might be there. And they're right, because I've invited the mayor, I've invited the chief of police, I've invited the neighbors, right? And so you can see how some of the stuff I argue reigns true, that if we get back on porches, if we get back in the streets on our bike, if we are walking on our streets, if we are having an event at somebody's property, then I say this all over the world, and it's kind of bad for me to say, but poking them, the riffraff in the community, the word gets out. And I think that's what we got to do, is get the word out more. Back to the church, one of the first things I did was go to the church and try to communicate to them my heartbeat. I said that I got a master's from the University of Aberdeen in community learning and development, and it was that, but it also minored in theology, practical theology. And so it sought to teach me to see all of this, public planning, urban planning, public policy, social work, to see it within the context of lived theology, or practical theology. And so I sort of wake up in the morning believing that the work I do is not social work, it's not community development work, I am not, and I am a real estate developer, a social worker, or whatever, but at the root of what I am is a fella that grew up in a neighborhood with a lived tradition that was Christian, and in so being raised that way, I see the world a particular way. And so I went to them with that speech, by the way, this church. And they had a divergent theology. And so I think they will not be an early adopter. I do understand that some folk will get on board early and forsake us later. And others will say, hey, we're not involved in that. We're about saving souls. And that's where they are, right? They are just... it's in their walls, but they aren't by themselves. I'm on tape, so I should be a little bit more cognizant of what I'm about to say, but I don't mind saying it. I think there are countless churches, to include the historic Black churches in my neighborhood, that need to improve upon their ability to understand what it means to be engaged in what's going on in there, as opposed to just commuting in on Sunday.
Well, my other question while I have.
Yeah.
I'm sure you thought of this, and it'd be interesting, to talk more about it. A couple of things. One is obviously, in some ways, kind of the sort of thinking back, on sort of when people would sit out on their porch. As important as that is socially, it was somewhat because people didn't have air conditioning, and because we've done a whole lot of houses with porches, and porches are important. But just making the porch doesn't make people sit out there. So I think, you know that. So I think what you're doing to kind of use the kind of porch in some ways, as a sort of reminder of the need for people to get out of their house.
Yeah, it is indeed a metaphor.
Right.
By the way.
To get out of their house, so that they are not kind of self-isolating themselves, right? So I think your sense of what I think is more common now in communities is creating these these kind of gathering places that might be, you know, a coffee shop, or it might be, you know, a park, or, you know, and it might be a kind of event, it might be a bike ride, you know, these kind of ways that people then have, that they have this kind of, that they kind of build that social capital, because it's not happening so much now because of things like, you know, air conditioning, and, you know, the things that our living situation continues to make us more isolated, right? You know, so it takes, as you know, it takes more effort, more kind of organization, a little bit more push to get people to not be so self isolating, where before it happened more kind of naturally, and the kind of coming and going, you know. And obviously you're real attuned to that, you know, in terms of, I mean, you have QR codes. I mean, you've brought the, you know, you certainly brought that recognition into, you know, kind of today's communication world. And I guess I say that because it seems like there is a really important opportunity to kind of, as part of your work, to not just use sort of this really kind of special location that has sit in this, you know, in this kind of like boundary condition, you know, between communities. Not just use that as a kind of historic context, but to use it as part of the narrative of the development, you know. And I think you're trying to figure out how to do that, but in terms of kind of how that pushes the investment that people might bring into it, in terms of, you know, either people that are investing in terms of their support, or even their, you know, kind of joining in to kind of help be part of the financial investment as well, you know. So I guess I asked that because in terms of what your thoughts in terms of how do you take this kind of real special story and have it be part of the sort of development, both the kind of energy and even what people would experience and think about even when it was completed.
Yeah. Yeah. If I understood your question right.
I'm sorry for such a long question.
No, I love it. I love it. It's why part of my, I don't know what time are we? Okay.
We're fine.
Okay, fine. So having been raised Christian context, the family business was really clergy, the pastorate, church. So prior to going to get a master's at the University of Aberdeen, I went to a conservative Bible college. So my trajectory, like so many others in my family, we've got like 13 pastors in my family, country. So that was my trajectory. But if you ask, and I love to tell, why aren't you pastoring? Why aren't you in ministry? Because for me, the pulpit, the podium, was it was in the way of me and community for me. And I remember the day I was preaching, and I just thought, man, would I love to really just be out here. This is where I want to be, right? So a long question. I love it because I want to be in dialogue. I want to be in conversation. And so with regard to your question, and how do I continue to tell this story and couch it in a way to where it is appealing and it allows a number of folk, particularly those that can invest in it, to sort of latch on, and not just latch on for a time, because I've had some, I've been at it now for 2-3 years. I've had some that really latched on to the bike ride I was initially doing, and now they're ghost, right? They're not around. But then I had some conversations with the MDA, Mississippi Development Authority, that told me I need to talk money more. I didn't mention it today, you know, like what will be the return on investment? Dollars for this, right? I now have a way to talk about, you know, the return on investment, right? So I am ever increasingly trying to improve upon how I communicate this message. At MDA last year, in a lunch meeting, being told I need to really, guy said to me, Ronnie, man, the stories about like your uncle and the neighborhood and stuff, like, I get it, man. I'm from Mississippi, so like that's great. But for some of the folk that you need to be on board with this, you need to couch this in an economic context and talk about it in that way. I'm sorry to be so crass, but it's just that way, Ronnie. And so I am continuing to try and learn how to strike that balance. But the one thing I just can't get away from is probably what I gave you today is this heart stuff.
Yeah.
So I want to balance. Another thing that I really am excited about is this work is sustainable over time. So like we could be talking about Magnolia Grove, and you guys know this. We could be talking about Gaston Point. We could be talking about a number of communities in Biloxi. We could be talking about a number of communities in Big St. Louis and Moss Point, Ashburn, DeLive. You know, we could Chicago, Southside, Oakland. This very same kind of a conversation is one that I shouldn't be so arrogant to say they're not happening, but it is one that can happen in all kinds of contexts and for years to come. You know, Chloe could take over what I'm doing and be doing this for the next 50 years because there are communities around the world that need folk to come in and be a part of their interest to unearth their story and begin to repair some of the breaches that has happened and repair some of the fabric of what is community and look for ways, partners and stuff to kind of revitalize what has been in disrepair for so long. So that's what
Ronnie, first of all, thank you for such a provocative and inspirational presentation. You mentioned you purchased the corner store. Is that where you're going to live, or is it going to be a commercial establishment, or?
great question. I should have done that. So it's various phases. So it's a corner store on the bottom, historic Broadmoor. Again, people went to that all the time. What we didn't know is there was an apartment up top. I now know it.
Okay.
A huge apartment. We want to split it in half and it'd be 2 loft apartments because it's just
Cool.
huge. And then there is a cottage on back, and we didn't know that was there. When I grew up going to that store, we had no idea that Mr. Buddy also owned the cottage behind the store. When I went to purchase it, I didn't know, oh, the cottage is coming with, oh, okay, great. This is the Broadmoor Cafe on the bottom, loft apartments, and a cottage on the back. So the Broadmoor Cafe, cottage, and lofts.
Great.
And we've acquired 3 lots to our north. So we have the corner store and go to 22nd Street. Just a year ago, we didn't have a couple of those lots, but a guy sold us just last year. So we acquired that. We were really worried because while it is a neighborhood business corridor by zoning standards, he was going to lobby zoning to build a house on it. So that was really going to mess up our plans because we want to see commercial business on the bottom and livable apartments, lofts, whatever on the top. Because we also really need to improve upon our density, I think, in this area. So,
And I just have a follow-up. Either part of Sacred Roots, like the Chicago area at all. Are there any examples that you can give of other communities that have undertaken something like this and it's been a success, or?
yeah, I'm part of a number of networks,
Okay.
some Christian, some not, around the country, where I could name quite a number of them. One that comes to mind is Wayne Gordon in Chicago. White guy, but moved into the neighborhood, I mean the hood, as a coach, coaching baseball, but really became enamored by and overwhelmed by the sense of, you know, what was going on with the kids he was working with. And so him and his family moved into this neighborhood. And for 35 years, sort of like been doing what I'm doing. So if you go to Lawndale in Chicago, which is oftentimes touted as what was like bad, the west side of Chicago and Lawndale in particular, it's where industry and all kinds of things had just like left and all kind. So yeah, I think that's an example of a success story, and there's ones all over the country. That is an example of a white guy moving in, and so there's some, kind of narrative questions and debates around that he accessed, the mayor of Chicago, for an example, to just give him a half a block in one instance, right? So we while I say, that is an example of a success story, I want to be very crassly honest about, I don't know an example of, I don't know of an example of somebody that did this. Trauma-informed community reinvestment. I don't know somebody that did.
Is that a term you coined, or is that, yeah?
You heard it here first. Something. Yeah. It'll be my PhD at Mississippi State. And there's trauma-informed everything today.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's reinvestment and community development everywhere. So all I did, I coined,
Yeah.
making it a compound, because I think that the success story that needs to be told is one where development came about in such a way to where it didn't re-traumatize. So being trauma-informed, first principle, do no harm. And I've been in community meetings where, part of teams, where we had community meetings, where we have invited people in and we've got their cuisine, whatever it was. So we've done all kinds of little things to like try and make it a hospitable environment for them. And yet, for some communities, even lining up these chairs the way we have lined them up today is re-traumatizing. Do you know the way these chairs are lined up? And I feel this in my body right now. The way these chairs are lined up is exactly like the welfare department. And for a woman that is struggling being a part of the welfare system, and sometimes that's just her station of life. It was my mom's station of life for a while. But a lot of times that comes with like dehumanizing experiences. When she comes through the door and the lady at the desk won't quite look at her, or the lady says, have a seat. So she sits lined up like this. She waits for her name to call her. She waits for that light to light up, right? All of those visceral things. When we come in to have a community engagement meeting, we do a similar thing, and we don't mean to, but trauma-informed means contemplating what are the lived experiences of these people we are calling into this process and this project, and being very concerned about that. So, I don't have the answer to what do we do. For some communities around the world, they put them in circles, and that's better. For some, they sit down on the floor. For some, they play music. You almost can't hear the presenter like me. I've been in communities where I was in Romania once, and they just pumping music. And I'm like, so, I don't want to be talking. I want to be listening to the music. But like, that was an environment where it was contextual and doing no harm. So I think ever increasingly we have to convene in that. So the trauma-informed reinvestment plan is to put on paper some of these ideas I have about like, how can we do this stuff and do it well so that we're not doing harm and trying to do good? Because we don't often, you don't even know it. I was in a meeting, and I'll stop here. I was in a meeting in, it was actually Chicago, but it was a meeting among new Americans and refugees. And we were going to go out from the meeting and go have a bite to eat. And it was, you're on your own for lunch. You're familiar with that, right? You go to a conference and sometimes they feed you and you eat together, and then there's some that are you're on your own. And so we broke out, and I was in charge of this session, which makes it relevant. Lesson learned. Okay, it's on your own. And I designed it, so I take ownership, that for these refugees and new Americans, there's no concept of you're on your own, I was told. Because we broke, and then I was like, so where did everybody go? And I thought they would just follow me to the nearest cafe and we'd all eat together and they would pay their Dutch, right? Is it Dutch? Yeah. There's no Dutch, I was told. And I noticed a couple of them like went into the little corner store and bought some bread and bologna, bread and bologna and stuff. And then they were just eating in the park. They had made a picnic in the cafe. So, lobby, one of them was like, Amos, what was going on? He was like, well, Ronnie, Dutch on your own? Like, no, that's not how we do community. That's not. Furthermore, Ronnie, these three guys here, they have nothing. They were looking forward to the community and it being able to provide them with a network and a meal. Like it was gonna be their meal that day. It's like, oh, and it's when I began to start thinking about this stuff that like we really got to be careful about how we convene people, even in our attempts to do good for people or with people. So the trauma-informed reinvestment plan, I think, it's worth the money I'm asking. And it's scalable. So I'm not creating it or interested in creating it or seeing it be built out for me. I'd like to see it be a part of the Gulf Coast Design Studios repertoire is what we do. You know, and to be honest, and not just because he's sitting here, the extent to which I am aware of how the Gulf Coast Design Studio functioned in Sewer City years ago, it echoed some of what I'm talking. You know, I didn't come in and they go, and they would have, yeah, all that white guy at the Gulf Coast Design Studio. Instead, you know what happened? When I moved back home, a gentleman, Constance, who knows me, knows my family, knows everybody. So I thought, I wrote him an email, I gave him this long email about who I am and I'm home. Hey, brother, here we meet. Brother wouldn't even meet with me until he checked in with this guy. So this guy validated me. I'm like, are you kidding me right now? But it's a tall tale sign of how you came in community. And it must have said they felt that you were at least cognizant of, again, that first principle, do no harm. Ask far more questions than make statements and really wrestle with folk about like, how do we do this and do this well? I'm grateful. If you know any of those reps, they will go in committee, I think starting next week. This is, we were, to apply, you put your project into this portal. Some folks do, should add. Put your project into this portal and it goes through this group of what is called the advisory council, which is local folk here to the coast. But then they send it up to the MDA that packages it in a binder about like that, all the projects from along the Gulf Coast. And so then they give that to the legislators. And so the legislators have on their desks this binder this big full of all of these projects that are looking for them to fund this year. And in it is the Gulfport Gaslight District. And so we really would love for them to hear from some folk about like, hey, that particular one, will you take a look at it? Allocate funds towards it. From that advisory council, we have been advanced by unanimous vote twice. So last year we advanced But I was told by Representative Bennett that nobody, they just didn't know us. They didn't know me. They didn't know us. So I learned something there. But this year we're hoping to being advanced again by unanimous vote that they do know us and that they would show favor to allot funds to this project. It is, I think I'm the only Black to advance.
Mm.
And so there's that. I think this project at the end of the day is something that is scalable to Magnolia Grove, Gaston Point, Biloxi, Bay St. Louis. And so in that, I think this is just crazy cool of a concept. And I haven't even talked about the Chitlin circuit yet. So what you could ask me is like, what kind of music would you play in that cafe? Well, I've had friends visit here from around the world and they want to Google where they can go to hear some authentic jazz or blues or gospel music that you people say you gave to the world. Why am I in Mississippi and I can't get it? Well, at the Broadway Cafe, where they can get it. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I don't know if you want the cereal now, Chloe, or that happens when you get home, but there's cereal over there.